Hi everyone, Jay Sennett here from jsennett.com. Today I wanted to talk to you about why I think transsexual and transgender people oftentimes hate the diagnosis of gender identity disorder. When I began transitioning in 1996, I too hated the diagnosis of gender identity disorder, in large part, and in fact solely because I didn't think I had a mental illness and I didn't want to be classified as crazy. I thought crazy, and I put that word in quotes, was a term that referred to people who had quote unquote real mental illness, unquote. I'm rather embarrassed to say these things now, having done a little bit of work around ableism and disability rights. I realized that I fell prey to a very narrow way of thinking about cognitive states, for lack of a better term. And a friend of mine who's a disability rights activist, who's also trans, said that he himself didn't really have an issue with the designation of gender identity disorder because he said a diagnosis is a diagnosis. And as transsexuals, we need a diagnosis to receive medical care, to receive ultimately authorizations for surgery. And my friend, who has a disability related to a medical diagnosis, feels very strongly and discussed with me how many roadblocks he has had put in his way as a person with a disability through his medical diagnosis. In fact, he argues, and he argued quite persuasively, that the medical establishment has never been a friend to people with disabilities, whether they're medical diagnoses or psychological diagnoses. And that really got me to thinking about why I was so hateful towards this idea that somehow I had a mental health disorder. And I realized it's just a phobia on my part that I learned from my environment. We don't treat people with mental health diagnoses particularly kindly. We laugh at them, we mock them, they're the butt of jokes. They don't receive the care they need. If they do, it's often very expensive. And I realized that from a certain perspective, and that perspective I would say is a middle class perspective, and middle class people, of which I would characterize myself as one, we really value normalcy. We value quiet. We value not sticking out too much. And sometimes people with certain mental health diagnoses, they're loud, they stick out, they don't conform. And in essence, what that says to me is that middle class people don't like people whose heads are broken, if you will. Their heads are broke. They're not sticking in. And I realized from that perspective of a middle class person, someone like myself, my head is also broken, right? I mean, I'm suffering under delusion that I'm a man, that I can change my gender. For some people, I'm just as delusional as someone who has a quote unquote true delusional diagnoses. And so when I realized that, I'm can be in solidarity with other people who have mental health diagnoses. We all need a diagnosis to get the care that we need. And so it seems to me that we should be working with disability activists to reduce barriers to entry for medical care, to reduce the phobias and real hatred that's directed at people with mental health diagnoses. And so, whether it's medical or psychological, I need a diagnosis, and doesn't really bother me anymore that I have a psychological diagnosis. Take care.